Jane sat nervously in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She took a deep breath and tried to calm her racing heart. "Jane Thompson," the receptionist called out, looking up from her computer screen. Jane stood up and made her way to the therapist's office, her palms sweaty and her stomach churning. She had been putting off this appointment for weeks, but knew she needed to face her fears if she ever wanted to overcome them. The therapist, Dr. Patel, greeted her with a warm smile and gestured for her to take a seat. "So, Jane, what brings you here today?" Dr. Patel asked. Jane took another deep breath and looked down at her hands. "I have a phobia of physical touch," she admitted quietly. Dr. Patel nodded and jotted down some notes on her clipboard. "Can you tell me more about that? When did it start?" Jane hesitated, unsure if she wanted to revisit the painful memories that had caused her phobia. But she knew she needed to open up if she wanted to get better. "It started a few years ago," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I was in a relationship with someone who was very physical, but not in a good way. He would touch me even when I didn't want him to, and it made me feel violated and helpless." Dr. Patel nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. It's understandable that you would develop a phobia as a result." Jane looked up at her, her eyes brimming with tears. "I just feel so broken," she whispered. Dr. Patel reached across the desk and placed a hand on Jane's arm, but quickly withdrew it when she saw the look of panic on Jane's face. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," she said. Jane shook her head, her breathing becoming more shallow. "It's not you," she said. "It's me. I just can't stand being touched." Dr. Patel nodded and made a note in her file. "Well, we have a lot of work to do, but I'm confident that we can make progress together. Are you ready to get started?" Jane took a deep breath as she entered her office building, steeling herself for another day of trying to avoid physical contact with her coworkers. She walked through the lobby, her eyes downcast, and was about to head for the elevator when she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, do you work here?" She turned to see a handsome man with sandy brown hair and bright blue eyes looking at her curiously. "Yes, I do," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm new here," the man said, holding out his hand. "I'm John. Nice to meet you." Jane's heart raced as she looked at his outstretched hand, knowing that she couldn't bear to touch it. "Nice to meet you too," she said, giving him a weak smile and quickly moving past him. As she rode up the elevator, she could feel the heat rising in her face. She had already made a terrible impression on her new coworker, and it was only a matter of time before he realized how weird and awkward she really was. When she got to her desk, she tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to John. She had to find a way to avoid him, but without being too obvious about it. Just then, her boss walked by and asked her to come into his office. "Jane, I wanted to introduce you to our new hire, John," he said, gesturing to the man sitting in the chair next to his desk. Jane's heart sank as she looked at John's friendly smile. She knew that she was going to have to work closely with him, and that was going to be a real challenge. As she left her boss's office, she couldn't help but wonder how she was going to survive working with someone who was so touchy-feely. She had a feeling that this was going to be a long and difficult journey. Just then, her phone rang, and she saw John's name flash across the screen. She took a deep breath and answered it, knowing that she couldn't avoid him forever. "Hey Jane, it's John. I was wondering if you wanted to grab lunch together?" Jane froze, unsure of what to say. She knew she couldn't handle being in such close proximity to someone for an entire lunch hour. But at the same time, she didn't want to hurt John's feelings. Sure," she said, her voice barely audible. "Great, I'll meet you in the lobby in 10 minutes, John said, before hanging up. Jane sank down into her chair, feeling like she was in way over her head. She had no idea how she was going to get through lunch with John without making a complete fool of herself. Jane sat nervously in the waiting room of her therapist's office, fidgeting with her hands and trying to steady her breathing. She had been to therapy before, but nothing seemed to help her overcome her fear of physical touch. She was starting to feel like she was doomed to a life of loneliness and isolation. When her therapist called her in, Jane took a deep breath and followed her into the small, cozy office. "Hello, Jane. How are you feeling today?" the therapist asked. Jane shrugged, not sure how to answer. "I'm okay, I guess," she said. The therapist nodded, and then asked, "Have you been working on the exercises we discussed in our last session?" Jane shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling guilty for not doing more to overcome her phobia. "Not really," she admitted. The therapist gave her a gentle smile. "That's okay. It can be difficult to confront our fears. But I believe that with time and practice, you can overcome this." Jane wasn't so sure. She had been dealing with this phobia for as long as she could remember, and nothing seemed to make it better. After the session, Jane walked out of the office feeling more lost than ever. She wondered if she was wasting her time and money on therapy, or if there was any hope for her to lead a normal life. As she headed back to work, she saw John waiting for her in the lobby. Her heart sank as she realized that she couldn't avoid him forever. "Hey, Jane," he called out, waving at her. Jane gave him a weak smile, feeling like she was going to have a panic attack at any moment. She knew she couldn't keep avoiding him, but she didn't know how to face him without making a complete fool of herself. As they walked to the cafeteria together, Jane tried to keep her distance from John, but he kept trying to engage her in conversation. "So, what do you like to do for fun?" he asked. Jane froze, feeling like she was being put on the spot. She didn't want to tell him about her phobia, but she also didn't want to lie. I like to read," she said, hoping that would be enough to satisfy him. But John wasn't deterred. "Oh, me too. What kind of books do you like?" Jane took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. She had to find a way to get through this lunch without making a complete fool of herself. After their lunch together, John seemed even more interested in getting to know Jane. He asked her out on a date, but she immediately turned him down. "I can't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have a phobia of physical touch." John looked surprised, but he didn't seem deterred. "That's okay," he said. "We don't have to touch. We can just go for a walk or grab a coffee or something." Jane shook her head, feeling frustrated. It wasn't that simple. She couldn't even handle being in close proximity to someone without feeling anxious and uncomfortable. "I appreciate the offer, John, but I don't think it's a good idea," she said. John seemed disappointed, but he didn't give up. "Okay, well, maybe we can just hang out as friends for now." "I don't want to make you uncomfortable." Jane wasn't sure if she could handle being friends with John. Every time she was near him, she felt like she was walking on eggshells. But she didn't want to be rude or hurt his feelings. "Sure, that sounds okay," she said, hoping that she wasn't making a mistake. Over the next few weeks, John continued to be persistent. He invited Jane to lunch, to the movies, and even to a concert. Jane found herself wanting to say yes, but her fear held her back. Every time she was near John, she felt like she was going to have a panic attack. She tried to keep her distance and avoid physical contact, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. One day, John caught her off guard by reaching out to give her a hug. Jane froze, feeling like she was going to pass out. She tried to pull away, but John didn't seem to understand. "Jane, what's wrong?" he asked, looking concerned. Jane felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She didn't know how to explain her phobia to him without sounding crazy. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I just can't." John looked disappointed, but he didn't push the issue. "Okay, I understand," he said. "But I hope you know that I'm here for you, no matter what." Jane felt a pang of guilt. She knew she was being unfair to John, but she didn't know how to overcome her phobia. She wondered if she would ever be able to have a normal relationship. Jane had been avoiding John for a few days after the hug incident, but he eventually caught up with her at work and asked her out on a date again. Feeling guilty about avoiding him, Jane agreed to go out with him. They decided to go to a new restaurant that had just opened up in town. When they arrived, John offered his arm to Jane, but she hesitated before taking it. She could feel her heart racing as they walked into the restaurant. It was crowded, and there were people everywhere. As they sat down at their table, Jane couldn't help but feel nervous. She tried to focus on the menu, but her mind kept wandering. John noticed her discomfort and tried to make small talk. "So, have you been here before?" he asked. "No, I haven't," Jane replied, trying to keep her voice steady. John ordered for both of them, and the food arrived shortly after. Jane tried to eat, but her appetite was gone. She could feel everyone in the restaurant watching her, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. Suddenly, a couple at the next table got up to leave, and as they walked past, the woman accidentally brushed against Jane's arm. Jane gasped and recoiled, causing her chair to fall over. John looked at her in alarm. "Jane, what's wrong?" Jane couldn't speak. She felt like she was drowning. She scrambled to her feet, knocking her water glass over in the process. "I'm sorry," she muttered, grabbing her purse and rushing out of the restaurant. John followed her outside, looking confused and worried. "Jane, what's going on? Did something happen?" Jane shook her head, unable to speak. She felt like a complete idiot. How could she explain to him that she had just had a panic attack because someone had accidentally touched her? "I'm sorry," she said again, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this." With that, she turned and ran away, leaving John standing there looking bewildered. Jane spent the next few days avoiding John. She couldn't bear the thought of facing him after what had happened on their date. She felt like a failure. But John was persistent. He kept calling and texting, trying to get in touch with her. Eventually, Jane agreed to meet with him again, but this time on her terms. They decided to take a walk in a quiet park. Jane hoped that being in a more peaceful setting would help her feel more relaxed. As they walked, John reached out to hold her hand. Jane froze, feeling a surge of panic rising in her chest. "Please don't touch me," she whispered. John looked at her with concern. "What's wrong, Jane? You know I would never do anything to hurt you." "I know, but it's just, I can't explain it," Jane said, feeling frustrated with herself. John nodded understandingly. "It's okay. We'll take things slow." But as they continued walking, a group of kids playing nearby accidentally kicked a ball in their direction. The ball bounced off Jane's leg, and she yelped in surprise. Suddenly, she was overcome with a sense of terror. She felt like the whole world was closing in on her, and she couldn't breathe. She pushed John away and stumbled backwards, feeling like she was going to pass out. John looked at her in shock, not sure what to do. "Jane, what's happening?" he asked, reaching out to steady her. But Jane was beyond words. All she could do was shake her head and run away, leaving John standing alone in the park. As she ran, she felt tears streaming down her face. She felt like she was never going to be able to overcome her phobia, and that she was destined to be alone forever. Jane sat across from her best friend, Emily, feeling nervous and vulnerable. She had never told anyone about her phobia before, but she needed someone to confide in. "Thanks for meeting me," Jane said, taking a deep breath. "I have something I need to talk to you about." "Of course, what's going on?" Emily asked, looking concerned. Jane hesitated for a moment, then started to explain her fear of physical touch and how it had affected her life. She told Emily about John and how he had been persistent in trying to date her, even though she had pushed him away. I don't know what to do, Jane said, feeling tears prick at her eyes. I like him, but I'm scared I'll never be able to have a normal relationship. Emily listened attentively, offering words of comfort and support. I'm sorry you're going through this, Emily said, placing a hand on Jane's shoulder. But you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here for you, and I know John cares about you too. Jane felt grateful for her friend's understanding, but she still wasn't sure if she was ready to take the risk with John. As she left Emily's apartment and walked down the street, she saw a couple holding hands and felt a pang of jealousy. Would she ever be able to experience that kind of closeness with someone? She tried to shake off the feeling and focus on the present moment, but it was hard when her phobias seemed to be lurking around every corner. Just as she was about to turn the corner, she heard someone call her name. It was John, standing on the opposite side of the street. Jane froze, unsure of what to do next. John watched as Jane froze on the other side of the street, her body tense and rigid. He had been worried about her lately, sensing that something was holding her back from fully opening up to him. As he crossed the street to approach her, he tried to put himself in her shoes. He knew what it was like to have fears and insecurities in relationships. He had been hurt before, and the thought of being vulnerable again was scary. Hey, he said softly, when he reached her. How are you? Jane hesitated for a moment before responding. I'm okay. Just trying to work through some stuff. John nodded, sensing that there was more to the story. He wanted to ask her what was going on, but he didn't want to push her. I know we haven't known each other for very long, he said, after a moment of silence. But I feel like we have a connection. And I want to explore that, if you're willing. Jane looked up at him, her eyes guarded. I want to, she said quietly. But I'm scared. I have this thing. It makes it hard for me to be close to people. John felt a wave of empathy wash over him. He knew what it was like to struggle with intimacy and trust. I get it, he said, taking her hand in his. I have my own stuff too. But maybe we can work through it together. Jane looked up at him, her expression softening. For a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. But then, a loud noise from a nearby construction site startled Jane, causing her to pull away from John and retreat into herself. John felt his heart sink. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. Jane and John had been seeing each other for a few weeks, but things had been a little tense between them since the incident with the construction noise. Jane was still struggling with her phobia, and John didn't want to push her too hard. One day, John had to cancel plans with Jane due to a family emergency. He sent her a message explaining the situation, but she didn't respond. The next day, Jane saw John talking to a woman at a coffee shop, and her mind immediately jumped to conclusions. She thought he was seeing someone else and had lost interest in her. When John tried to contact her later that day, Jane ignored his calls and texts. She couldn't bear the thought of being hurt again. Days passed, and the tension between them only grew. Jane was avoiding John at work and everywhere else, causing John to feel confused and hurt. Finally, John managed to corner Jane one day after work. What's going on? He asked, frustration and concern evident in his voice. Jane took a deep breath, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. I thought you were seeing someone else, she said, her voice breaking. John looked bewildered for a moment, before understanding dawned on his face. No, Jane, that's not what's going on, he said quickly. I had a family emergency that day, remember? I tried to tell you. Jane looked down at her feet, feeling embarrassed and ashamed. I know, I'm sorry. I have this thing. It makes it hard for me to trust people. John took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. I know. But you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here for you, if you'll let me be. Jane looked up at him, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe things could work out between them after all. But then, a loud noise from a nearby car horn made her jump, and she pulled away from John, feeling embarrassed once again. As John and Jane sit in a park, enjoying a picnic, John takes a deep breath and looks at Jane with a serious expression. "Jane, I want to show you how much you mean to me," he says, pulling out a guitar from his backpack. "I wrote a song for you." Jane's eyes widen in surprise as John begins to strum the chords of a sweet melody. However, as the first verse starts, a group of people come jogging by, and Jane quickly recoils, trying to avoid any physical contact. John stops playing, confused. "What's wrong?" "I'm sorry, I can't do this," Jane says, feeling overwhelmed. "I can't be around people like this." John looks hurt and disappointed. "Jane, I understand that you have a phobia, but you can't let it control your life. Please, just give me a chance." Jane takes a deep breath and nods. "Okay, I'll try." As John begins to play again, Jane tries her best to focus on the music and the lyrics. But just as John reaches the chorus, a dog runs up and jumps on Jane's lap, causing her to yelp in fear and jump away. John puts down the guitar, looking defeated. "I'm sorry, Jane. I just wanted to do something special for you." Jane takes a moment to compose herself before replying, "It was a beautiful song, John. I appreciate the effort, even if it didn't quite go as planned." John smiles, relieved. "Thank you, Jane. I just want to make you happy." As they pack up their picnic and walk away from the park, Jane wonders if she'll ever be able to overcome her phobia and fully let John into her life. As Jane continues her therapy sessions, she slowly begins to make progress. She learns coping mechanisms and relaxation techniques to manage her anxiety around physical touch. However, when she accidentally brushes against a stranger in a crowded area, she feels a panic attack coming on and quickly retreats to a corner to avoid any further contact. Her therapist reminds her that progress is not always linear and encourages her to continue practicing the techniques she has learned. As Jane leaves the therapy session, she can't help but wonder if she will ever be able to fully overcome her phobia and have a normal relationship with John. The thought leaves her feeling both hopeful and scared. As John and Jane decide to give their relationship another chance, they both know it won't be easy. John understands and respects Jane's phobia, but he also wants to be able to express his affection towards her in a physical way. Jane, on the other hand, worries about being triggered by any physical touch and is constantly on edge when they are together. Their first date after getting back together is at a cozy restaurant. They sit across from each other and John keeps his hands to himself, giving Jane the space she needs. As they chat and laugh, Jane starts to relax and enjoy herself. However, when the waiter comes over to take their order and accidentally brushes against Jane's arm, she freezes up and feels a wave of panic wash over her. John immediately notices and tries to reassure her, but Jane is too overwhelmed and asks to leave. As they step outside, John takes her hand to comfort her, but Jane pulls away and apologizes for ruining the night. John tells her it's okay and suggests they go for a walk instead. As they stroll through the city, Jane tells John how much she appreciates his patience and understanding. John admits that he is scared too, but he is willing to work through their challenges together. They both smile at each other, feeling hopeful about their future. But just as they turn the corner, they run into a group of rowdy teenagers who start bumping into them. Jane feels her anxiety rising, and as one of the teenagers bumps into her, she freezes up and lets out a scream. John quickly steps in to protect her, but the situation leaves them both shaken. As they make their way back to Jane's apartment, they both realize that their relationship will take time and effort to work through. But they also know that they are willing to do whatever it takes to be together. Jane sat in her therapist's office, feeling anxious as usual. But today was different. She had been making progress in her therapy sessions, and she felt like she was getting closer to overcoming her phobia. "So, Jane," her therapist started. "How have you been feeling since our last session?" "I've been doing okay," Jane replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I've been practicing the exercises you gave me, but it's still hard to be around people sometimes. That's understandable, the therapist nodded. But I want to try something different today. I want you to imagine yourself in a situation where someone touches you, and I want you to try to stay calm and focused. Jane nodded hesitantly, her heart rate starting to pick up. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, imagining herself in a crowded room, surrounded by people. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder, and her eyes flew open. It was her therapist, gently touching her to simulate a real-life scenario. Jane's first instinct was to pull away, but she forced herself to stay still and breathe deeply. To her surprise, the panic didn't come. She felt a sense of calm wash over her, and she realized that she had finally made a breakthrough. That was amazing, the therapist exclaimed. You did so well, Jane. I think we're making real progress here. Jane couldn't help but smile, feeling a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe she could overcome her phobia after all. As she left the therapist's office, she couldn't wait to share the news with John. She was excited to see how he would react, and maybe this breakthrough would help them finally move forward in their relationship. But as she stepped out of the building, she saw a familiar figure across the street. It was John, and he was holding hands with another woman. Jane felt her heart sink, and she quickly turned around, trying to avoid being seen. She didn't know what to do next. Should she confront John? Or just pretend she didn't see anything and move on? The decision weighed heavily on her mind as she made her way back home. As Jane sits in shock, John pleads with her to listen to his side of the story. I'm sorry, Jane. I made a mistake, but I love you. It was a moment of weakness and I regret it so much, John says. But Jane can't bring herself to forgive him. The pain of her trust being broken is too much to bear. I can't do this, John. I can't be with someone who doesn't value our relationship enough to wait for me, Jane says before getting up to leave. John reaches out to grab her hand, but Jane flinches and pulls away. She realizes that despite the progress she's made in therapy, her phobia is still there. As she walks away, Jane can't help but wonder if she'll ever be able to have a healthy relationship.